I really feel like that's the difference between good athletes and great athletes. Great athletes are able to both look at the numbers, the actual analytics, the actual data, and use that data, but they're also incredibly aware of their own sensation and how they feel and where they are at that level.
The Triathlon Show 221. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview coach Ryan Bolton. Ryan was an Olympic athlete from the Sydney 2000 Olympics. He has won Ironman Lake Placid and been on the podium in various Ironman races in his long distance career. And now he is the founder of Bolton Endurance and coaches elite triathletes and runners. Some of his most famous athletes would be Ben Hoffman, who was fourth in Kona in 2019, and Caroline Rotich, who is a marathoner and half marathoner and is a former winner of the Boston Marathon. So we'll get into his coaching methodology and discussions around how he periodizes things, what he thinks about base training, etc., etc. Tons of great things in this interview that I really enjoyed chatting about. But before we do that, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. If you haven't checked out Precision Hydration's blog, that's a wealth of knowledge about not only hydration, but endurance training in general. One of the episodes that I think is, one of the blog posts that I think is good to highlight from the blog is called How to Stay Hydrated During Winter Training. I will link to that in the episode description. And this is a blog post written by Andy Blow, where Andy has provided some tips for staying hydrated during the off-season or during winter training. And he has given some takeaways. There's a list of 5 take-home messages at the end of the post. So even if you think that, well, I don't have time to read a blog post, you can get the main message of the post in just 30 seconds if you scroll down to that. So if nothing else, that would be something that is worth taking your time to do. So we'll link to that in show notes, as I said. And if you want to get 15% off Precision Hydration's electrolytes, use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And big thanks to Roka. You can go to roka.com/TTS. That is the landing page where you'll get a 20% discount code for any Roka order. One thing that Roka is focusing on heavily, in addition to their traditional wetsuits and tri-suits, is their sunglasses and their prescription glasses. So the prescription glasses are for now offered on the US website. But they are similar to the sunglasses in that the styles are really classic and good looking, but they're designed to do anything in them, whether it's running, cycling, or doing CrossFit or whatever you want to do. They stay on. You can't shake them off your head. They are lightweight. They have the Geeko anti-slip technology and all the research and development that has gone into Roka's sunglasses line has gone into the prescription glasses as well. In addition to that, you have loads of customization options for the sunglasses and the prescription glasses, and you have home try-on options as well. This applies to the United States, though. So again, the webpage is roka.com/TTS, and that's where you can get a 20% discount code. Without any further ado, here's the interview with Ryan Bolton. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Ryan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's morning here in the United States, so I think I'm catching you in the afternoon, correct?
Yep, late afternoon, early evening. So it's a day of podcasting here. Actually, I have 3 of these interviews lined up for today, so it's exciting. It's one of the parts of my job that I really love the most. So excited to be in the middle of it.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, no, I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is kind of my home base, although I feel like I'm only here about 30 days of the year because of travel with racing and et cetera. But Santa Fe it's an amazing place in the United States because it's at about 2,100 meters, a little bit higher than that. And you have access up to, 3,500 meters. So it's a really great place for altitude training. The facilities here, we have a 50-meter pool, and there's just kind of running and cycling galore. So it's a nice place. However, it's been a bit of a cold and snowy winter. So as I look out my window right now, I'm looking at like a foot or so of snow on the ground. So, it's it's been a little more challenging for training this year.
Oh, wow, for sure. Lots of indoor trainer usage for the triathletes that you have there, and treadmill for runners.
Yeah, for the local athletes, that's for sure. Yeah, although, and we'll get into this more in the future of this conversation, but most of my athletes, especially my professionals, are not based here. They're based all over, but we meet up in various different places, including here, but normally not here at this time of the year.
All right. So let's get into your background a little bit more, because you're a US Olympian in triathlon, but you also have a strong running pedigree. That's your first entry into endurance sports, I think. So can you talk a little bit more about where you came from and then how you got into coaching and your coaching history as well?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I grew up in a relatively rural area in Wyoming, which, is in the north kind of, western part of the United States, and actually at altitude as well. And fortunately, the place where I grew up was really supportive of athletics, all types of athletics. And I was kind of an energetic kid. And so I started swimming at a very, very young age, I think, to try to cut back on my energy levels. And then, I got into running at that age too. And I actually got into BMX bike racing, which was a lot of fun. But, as I progressed, I decided to run in college because that was what I was strongest in. I could have swam in college as well, but the life of swimmers is not very glamorous. And the thought of getting in water for, those 4 years of my collegiate career at 5 a.m. every morning really did not sound appealing, whereas going for a run at 5 a.m. sounded much more. So I chose to be a runner. And I had an interesting background with triathlon at that point because I actually, this was in the very early 90s. And, the ITU World Championships were happening at that point. And I was actually dabbling in little triathlons here and there, but, mostly I was a runner. So I wasn't doing it too extensively. But the summer after my freshman year of college, I was living in Boulder, Colorado, which was only 2 hours from where I went to college. And one of my best friends ran at Boulder. And so I went down there and had nothing to do with triathlon. Once again, this was in 1992. It had all to do with Boulder was way cooler than where I went to school. And there were a lot more cute girls in Boulder than where I went to school. So it seemed like a brilliant place to spend the summer. And when I was there, I was a lifeguard. So I was a lifeguard at Scott Carpenter Pool, which is kind of a famous swim pool in Boulder. If you've ever been there before, it's an outdoor 50-meter, and a lot of people train there. And during, I would always swim on my lunch break. And a pro triathlete, and that was back in the days when Mark Allen, Dave Scott, Christian Bustos, Mike Pigg, a lot of kind of the early big names of triathlon were training in Boulder. And so, I kind of got to see these guys on a daily basis, and it was kind of normal. And once again, I wasn't really a triathlete. So, I knew who these guys were, but, they weren't in my realm or in my world, I guess. But anyway, I would swim at lunch, and a pro triathlete saw me swimming. He said, "Hey, you look like you're a runner, but you're a really good swimmer. Have you done a triathlon?" And I said, "Yeah, I have before." And so he said, "Well, are you interested in doing them again?" And I said, "Well, I'm training for a cross-country season coming up in the fall, but, maybe." And he said, "Well, if you want to see how good you can be, you should go to the US National Championships." And I said, "Okay." And he kind of gave me the information, and I went on a couple bike rides with this guy. And anyway, at the end of the summer, I went to national championships, and I won the national championships. And USA Triathlon at the time, kind of grabbed me, and they said, "Who are you? we don't even know who you are. You haven't been a junior in our whatever. But I ran a really fast run split, of course. I can't remember what I ran, but probably like 31:30 or something off the bike, which, I mean, for whatever, a 19-year-old was pretty good. And so the next year I decided to I move and live in Boulder again for the summer and actually train for triathlon. And that was the summer of '93. And at the end of that summer, I did the World Championships in Manchester, England, and I ended up getting second place there. And I believe I had the fastest run split of the day over everyone, over all the pros and everyone. I think Spencer Smith won that year, and Lessing was maybe second, or vice versa. I can't quite remember. And and in the junior ranks, it was a really interesting year too, especially for my era, because if you go back and look at some of the names in the race, there were some pretty notable names. Like I think Chris McCormick was fourth place that year. I think Norman Stadler was in the race. But anyway, kind of a lot of the old school guys from my generation were there. But unfortunately, as I did great. I was 19 years old, and I got second at Worlds. But about 2 weeks later, I went back to college, and my running coach said, "Congratulations, that's a great job. However, we're paying you to run in college, not to do this whole triathlon thing, and you need to make a decision." And I kind of weighed, the cost of a college education versus what I could make as a professional triathlete for those couple of years. And I decided to completely hang the bike and swim Kazi up and just run my college career out, which actually ended up being a great decision.
Yeah, and I can imagine with the cost of college education. I'm lucky being from Finland with free education all the way up through university level. But I don't find it surprising that you chose to go that route and make sure that you got your college education paid for. How did that then proceed into you getting back into triathlon and eventually becoming professional and going to the Olympics?
Yeah, well, it was beneficial, and I think in this day and age, and I deal with this actually in my current, one of my roles right now is I work with USA Triathlon. I'm their high performance technical advisor is my title with them. But looking at athletes who, make the choice to either stay in school in their single sport and or pursue triathlon. And I think in this day and age, I don't know if that would be the best choice, honestly. Like, I think it's good to, be developing those triathlon skills throughout that pretty critical period. But back in my day, it was actually, I felt like it was an advantage to stay in school because I was really able to develop my run, and I became an even better runner, in those last couple of years in college. But kind of serendipitously, it was 96. I was finishing college, and they announced, that the Olympics, or that triathlon were going to be in the Olympics in the 2000 cycle. And right around the same time, I was chatting with USA Triathlon and some of the people involved there. And I also was invited and got a really great opportunity to go stay in Southern California with Dan Ampfield. At the time, Dan, now he runs Slow Twitch. But at the time, he was the owner of Quintana Roo, which, they were kind of at the forefront of the triathlon wetsuit and bike movement. And so for me, I was a totally dead broke 21-year-old, and Dan was offering me, free bikes and free wetsuits and a place to live, and this amazing training in Southern California. And I basically said I'm in, and I moved out there, and instantly kind of dove in to the triathlon scene, with 1997 being my first year of racing. And fortunately, just based on, what I'd done as a junior and everything, I was able to get a pro card and, start racing professionally right away.
And then the road to the Olympics in the 2000s, how was that a difficult process? Was there a lot of competition for the slots, and how did that eventually pan out? Because I know that after that you also went into long distance racing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was interesting back in the day, and once again, now that I'm, very involved with the ITU process again, it was chaos. It was we were really on our own when it came to racing and everything. In '97, I didn't do any ITU stuff. I actually started doing ITU stuff in '98. And it was really like, we were basically figuring out our own travel, and how to get to races. And the point system was really confusing to me. I mean, it still can be if you're not educated on it. But it was kind of up to me, and without too much support from the federation. They gave a little bit of financial support, but not tons of logistical support, to get to those races and figure the scene out. At that point, I would say there was only one American that was really embracing the ITU circuit, and that was Barb Lindquist. And fortunately, Barb, it was one of my first ITU races, if not my first. It was in Gamagori, Japan. And once again, I was kind of this green triathlete, and I showed up there and with no hotel room, but as a mistake, there was no hotel room for me. And Barb kind of like grabbed me and took me under her wing for those first couple races and started showing me the ropes, which was incredibly, incredibly beneficial. As far as competitive, I mean, it was still very competitive. I would say the racing's different, and we can talk about that later in our talk than it is now. But I mean, making the team, and that was basically when everyone was starting to really aggressively go after points and try to get ranked so that you could make ultimately your Olympic team and qualify for the Olympic trials process, whatever that was for your country.
How did the Olympics go, and did you move into long distance right after that, or was there a transition period where you still were racing ITU, or perhaps both at the same time?
Yeah, I made a quick transition. So my first year of racing, I was just on my own as far as training goes, and I was basically beating the crap out of myself, as you can imagine. I was a 22-year-old that knew absolutely everything. And that was stupid and dangerous because, as we all know, at 22, we don't know everything. In fact, we know very little. but I thought I knew I was doing a bit, and I just kind of like totally trashed myself with training. And so my second year of racing, I actually started working with Joe Friel. And, Joe's like, he's kind of a godfather of training within triathlon, and he's written so many books about it, and he was exactly what I needed. And I continue to have a great relationship with him to this day. And he actually coached me throughout my entire career. But he coached me through the Olympics. The Olympics went okay. I would say I didn't go in to the Olympics with 100% fitness. I was just like, little issues here and there. And I had an okay race. I actually had a good swim, but I crashed on the bike. I think there were about 7 or 8 of us that went down on the bike. I was kind of like almost like right in the middle of this pile up at a bottleneck. And as you know, in draft legal racing, the pack was gone. The front pack at that point, I mean, I think there were, 50, 55 guys in the race. The front pack at that point was seriously at least 30 of us, I would say, because it really came together. And but anyway, that was the last lap of the bike. Yeah, I went down and it was over. I mean, I got back up, and I had holes in my kit and all that stuff and a few scrapes. So nothing from an injury standpoint that was keeping me from finishing. But I basically had a time trial to the very tail end of the pack, coming into transition, maybe 30 seconds back from, the guys that were, coming first into transition, and I'm all lactated up, and it made it tough. So I ended up getting 25th place, which not super proud of, but I made the best of the day that I could. And people often ask, if you wouldn't have crashed, do you think you could have won? And my answer is no. I don't think I could have. I don't think it was my day. I don't think that I was in that level of fitness that it would have taken to win that race. So, the guys who won that race, and Simon Whitfield, who actually won, completely deserve that victory.
Yeah, well, I guess that's consolation in a way to know that on that day you probably wouldn't have won anyway. Like if you were feeling that you were in the shape that you seriously could have won, then it might be a bit more bittersweet to have that kind of accident happen. But you went on to win some Ironman races, Ironman Boulder, I believe, and race for a while on the long distance circuit before going into coaches. So just to wrap up the career story here with how that went about, and then how you came to move into coaching.
Yeah, so you're right. After the 2000 Olympics, I basically sat down with my coach, and he, asked basically where my heart was and what I wanted to do. And I always felt like Ironman, I was probably physiologically a better Ironman athlete. And so I kind of made the decision to completely cut ITU out and draft legal stuff out and instantly dive into Ironman stuff. And that's what I did. I did Ironman racing for the next 4 years. I won Ironman Lake Placid. I raced Hawaii a couple times. I qualified for Hawaii every year until I retired, but and I never put together a very great race there. And we can talk about that later too. But I mean, that race takes experience and everything. And I guess if there's one regret in my career, I wish that I would have given myself more time there. But yeah, I only raced for 4 more years after that. So technically I was only racing professional for 8 years. But I got to the point, and I was still pretty young, where I was feeling not totally fulfilled with what I was doing as an athlete. And I was definitely getting more interested in the coaching side of things. My undergraduate degree was in exercise physiology. I had a seed planted to go back to graduate school in exercise physiology, metabolism, nutrition type studies. And I got to the point where I wasn't feeling like I was putting 100% into, training and racing. And being a pro triathlete, really, that's, you've got to be basically 100% committed. And said, if I can't be 100% committed, I'm going to, drop this and go back to school. And that's what I did exactly. I immediately went back to graduate school. I think the day that I sat down with my coach and said, I don't think I'm going to race anymore, the next day I was talking to my old graduate professors or college professors about graduate school. And by 4 months later, I was actually back in school.
Yeah. And after school, is that when you got into coaching, or what was the steps that happened from there?
Yeah, it was. When I went back to school, I stayed in close contact with my old coach, Joe Friel, and he had a coaching group, and he was really encouraging me to get involved with coaching. And I actually took on, a few just age group clients during that period. And then as soon as I got out, I actually went to work with a nonprofit organization, which was fun. And I also, was coaching some people. And then I made like a pretty big decision to move to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And when I moved to Santa Fe, the coaching stuff really started taking off with both the East African runners that I work with and continue to work with, but also, with the triathletes.
So what does your athlete roster look like now? You have, as you say, both runners and triathletes in your group. And what is the breakdown of pros versus amateurs for you, but also for your coaching group? Because now you have an entire coaching group yourself, I believe.
Yeah, it's evolved over the years. And initially I was working with mostly age group triathletes, amateurs. And then I had a fairly bigger group of elite runners and East Africans. And over the years, based on time and kind of interest, I would say, is I weaned off the runners, and I still have a few like world-class runners, and which is great. And then but over the years, I've kind of transitioned into working with more professional triathletes. And then, of course, I have my age groupers. But our coaching group, we have about 15 coaches that work with us, and they work with all levels of athletes, from around the world, basically. And our coaches are kind of based everywhere as well. So it works out really well that way.
Yeah. So who are some of the household names that people will know about that you're coaching in, whether it's triathlon or running?
Yeah. I'd say some of my most notables is in triathlon. I coach Ben Hoffman. I've worked with Ben for a few years now. I would say the best year that we've had is this past year with him. He just had a really great year. I mean, in Hawaii was right around the 8-hour mark. He was 4th place. He ran a 2:42. He's only He had the second fastest run split of the day. And then, a month after that, he went to Ironman Florida and ran a 2:36 off the bike, which was phenomenal. And, Ben in general is known as being a cyclist, a really strong cyclist. And one of the things that we really wanted to work on, because it's critical, is, to win Kona is you've got to be able to run fast. And that's what we really want to develop that. I'm now working with Heather Jackson, who, once again, top American female in Ironman. I believe she was 5th in Kona this last year. I'm super psyched to be working with her. She's a really great athlete. Even though she's been around for a while, I feel like there's a lot of things that she can improve upon that will make her a real threat in Kona. I work with Caroline Rotich. She's probably one of the most famous people that I work with because she won the Boston Marathon a few years back with me. She's still running. She's actually running Boston again this year. She actually ran a 1:08 half marathon yesterday in Houston, which was it was a training race for her, and it was a decent race. But I'm continuing to work with her. A couple of young guy triathletes. One that I would say had a breakthrough year last year. His name's Sam Long. He's an American based in Boulder. He won a couple 70.3s last year and Ironman Chattanooga. Young, 20, actually just turned 24. He's 23, so tons of potential, just a beast on the bike. And then I guess, I've had a handful of other athletes, pro triathletes and a couple runners as well.
So in terms of your coaching, what is if you can describe it, and I kind of really don't like the word coaching philosophy or the term coaching philosophy, but it's the one I use because I don't know how else to describe what I'm trying to ask about. So can you just describe your coaching, I guess?
Right. Yeah, totally. I guess, a few key terms that come up that I'm a big subscriber of is definitely, periodization. I periodize training in a pretty big way, and also specificity. And when I talk about specificity, it's both race dependent, but probably more important than that, athlete dependent. I can tell you that, athletes that I work with, sure, we have some core principles that we follow and that I believe in, but definitely each athlete I treat as an individual, and they respond to different things. What Ben Hoffman needs is very different than what Heather Jackson needs, and we address those things and we work on those things. But I would say core principles is, like I said, that specificity factor and periodization. I really believe in, building a big solid foundation and a big solid base with athletes, and with some good volume for sure. And then, of course, as we get closer to competitions, adding that specificity phase of the training while maintaining pretty big volume. I would guess that, in general, relative to maybe the general population, I do believe in higher volume work, and balancing that out with the intensity and very much race specific work. And I also believe in a lot of strength-based work. And when I say that, I mean, specific workouts that are, how do I describe it? Designed to replicate the feelings and sensations that you get in an Ironman competition, late in the race, which is hard to do. So that's a big part of it as well. But like I said, probably more important than anything is, the specific things for athletes and making athletes or helping athletes address their weaknesses. And that, I think that's a really big thing, because, when you're a hammer, everything you see is a nail. And so you work with a person who's a very good cyclist and they want to ride more, and you need to get them to swim or run more, and et cetera. You can go with all those examples. Yeah.
So that's an obvious one. If there's one particular discipline that's lagging behind, just doing more of that is an obvious way of working with that individual's specific needs. What are some other examples of how that might look like? Maybe it's not the disciplines, but specific aspects of their performance or physiology that you want to address for the individual. Can you give some example of that?
Sorry. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, are there any other examples of other than just if you're weak in your swim, then you need to swim more, or if you're weak in your run, then you need to run more? Do you have any other examples of how you work with that individual specificity and the individual's needs in mind? Like, do you, for example, do some sort of testing to determine physiological needs, or is it more a case of looking at race performances and see where the performance maybe breaks down and addressing that, or how do you figure out, I guess, what the specific needs of the individual are?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a combination of all those things, of course. And, one of the most basic tests, and I say this with age groupers, amateur athletes as well, is if you ask a person if they would rather do a 6-hour bike ride or if they would rather do a 1-hour bike ride with 6 by 5 minute all out intervals, and they tell you that they would rather do the 6-hour bike ride, that probably means that they need that hour bike ride with the 6 5-minute intervals and vice versa. You can almost tell a person's physiology and or their needs by just how they answer a simple question like that. But one is just looking at, like what you said, is obviously, looking at race results. Where are they weaker? Where are they stronger? But also looking at testing, and we do different types of, physiological testing, metabolic testing, see where they are, strong, where they do need work. And once again, I like to look at metabolism a lot. Like how are they processing sugar? How are they processing fat? At what rates, at what percentages of threshold are they doing those things? How they respond to that. And, it obviously would look different between an Olympic distance athlete and an Ironman type athlete, or even a 70.3 athlete. But the other thing is watching their training and watching how they respond. And, that's pretty simple, especially when you're hands-on with athletes and seeing them on a somewhat regular basis. You can see, especially as you're working with them and with other athletes, which people have, need, like, for example, Vo2 work, what type of people need more like tempo work. And it's funny because people with Caroline Rotich, she's one of the best runners in the world. And people have asked me, have you ever given her a Vo2 Max test? And I said, no, I've never done that with her. And honestly, I don't want to. And because, in fact, like with her, as an example, I don't think her Vo2 is ultimately that high on paper. And because of the way she responds in workouts to that type of stimulus, and whereas she responds to other type of stimulus, or her ability, I guess, to say, performing in a certain stimulus is way better. And to me, like as a coach, obviously, I said, well, that's a weakness of hers. That's something that we need to work on. So you inject that more into the training program for her. Whereas, I wouldn't necessarily do that in another athlete of her same caliber who maybe needs a different input.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And in terms of periodization, that's another interesting point that I want to discuss a bit more, because it's something that you quite often hear, although I'm not saying that a lot of coaches are doing the same thing around the year, but periodization seems to be falling a bit out of favor, and a lot of people don't really like to use that term even though in some ways it is what they're doing. So maybe we're just talking semantics here. But it seems that maybe it's a bigger part of your coaching than it might be for some others, because a lot of coaches seem to be talking about doing things more at a consistent level through the season these days. That's the impression that I get from doing a lot of these injuries. Would you agree with that? And how come you have found that for you the really periodized way seems to work so well?
Right. Well, so I think it is a lot semantics, like what you said is, there's so much talk about periodization and people, saying, oh, I'm getting away from that. And then you say, well, let me see what the year looks like for you. And they're like, well, we go through a rest period and then we build up for a while and we add some more specificity. It's kind of like, okay, yeah, that's periodization. And, but also, I guess another thing which is interesting, and this happens, I would say, more with like short course athletes, is like actually block periodization, which is kind of, a similar concept of, throwing in very, different types of training cycles depending upon, what's coming up ahead, and really blocking it out that way. And I would say with shorter course athletes that have maybe more peaks in their season, then that's doable, or have more variability in the types of racing that they're doing. They're doing anything from, super sprint racing to like 70.3 racing. You may have a little more of that. But me, and traditionally, I would definitely say that I'm more of a traditional periodized schedule, in that I'm a big believer in, taking a rest period. And when I look at periodization, you can look at it on a yearly cycle, on say a monthly-ish cycle, and then also on a weekly cycle. And yearly I do, particularly with Ironman type athletes and/or marathoners, your longer racing athletes, I really do like to go through phases of, rest, and then stimulus and stress, and some pretty extreme stress, and then resting and recovering from that. I would say one way that maybe I'm different with some periodized training is I like to keep, as long as an athlete's capable of handling it, and usually more experienced athletes, and especially Ironman athletes, I like to keep volume relatively high. So the goal in base season, or whatever you call it when you're building your foundation, is to build up some strength and some foundation and some aerobic fitness, so that when I start injecting like the specificity and speed work and race specific work, that we can maintain a pretty similar volume than what we were doing in a base phase. And like I said, with Ironman training, that makes a lot of sense, or at least to me it does, because you need to be, because really when you're talking about race specificity, you're talking about whatever, 7.5 to, 8.5 hour, 9-hour race, depending. So like, an athlete, like people would be like, oh, so you get rid of volume, going into the, specific phases. It's like, no, because you still have to be able to ride 180 kilometers and run, 42 kilometers, which is quite a bit of volume in itself. So the goal of those early, like the base season, basically is to get an athlete strong enough, healthy enough, aerobically fit enough to be able to handle the more race speeds specificity at a similar volume without breaking down. And another thing that I am an advocate of, though, as well, is recovery and rest cycles, and definitely injecting that recovery into that. So into those cycles on a and once again, that's very athlete dependent. Some athletes, that's every couple of weeks we need to inject a few days to 6-7 days in, and other athletes they can go 5 weeks before you need that. It totally is athlete dependent.
Yeah, that gives us a really good overview, so thank you for that explanation. So if we go into, just as an example, and this could be perhaps even if you choose a professional triathlete as an example here to give an idea. For the structure of a training week, if you can give an example of this time of year when we are in January and they're probably in their base phase doing quite a lot of volume, what might that week look like?
Yeah, like, a typical week, well, I guess you want to know like actual numbers, like volume numbers, or just kind of...
Yeah, a little bit like that would be good, yeah.
Yeah. Well, once again, it's dependent upon the athlete and what they're working on. But normally in, say, like a January phase and even a February phase, depending upon when first races are, like we're often working on, a specific weakness. And so what that would depend upon, and this is just kind of like a general overall concept, is whatever that weakness is that's probably where the volume relatively is at its highest. So, if somebody's like working on their biking, we're working on a lot of strength work on the bike and putting in, bigger than normal volume. Whereas, the other two sports maybe in general are taking a little bit more of a back seat. So, if we're talking about an athlete who's relatively balanced, then basically for, swimming and biking and running, I would say there's probably 2 to 3 workouts of each week that consist of like significant or relatively, significant volume. One of the big things, though, is I like to make, and at all phases, all times, is I like to make hard days hard and relatively big, and easier days easy. And once again, that's all a relative thing, because, if a hard day is an 8-hour day, for some specific athlete, an easy day, maybe 3 hours, but people would be like, oh, well, 3 hours doesn't seem like an easy day. And it's like, well, if you're doing 8 hours the day before, it actually is. And if a person is at that level of fitness, then that's, something that they can handle. But, this time of the year, kind of, yeah, like I said, probably getting 3 key sessions of each. And another big part that I like to incorporate into this time of the year is actual strength work, like actually being, in the weight room and hitting that relatively hard, because you can, without the high level of intensity with, both swimming, biking, and running, all 3 of those, you can actually hit the weights a little bit harder and really start, building up that strength too. Once again, as a foundation to build upon when we get into higher intensity work.
So can you give an example of one key session per discipline for this pro triathlete at this time of year?
Yeah. Well, I would say in base periods, sometimes I would say the most key session is the long aerobic session. So nothing special about that. Go ride your bike for 6 hours. But another thing, and I would say this, like specifically with in the pool, working on getting fatigued. So doing a longer workout, working with strength work. So paddles, like doing pulling, but then making sure and emphasizing some big stroke work at the end. So basically teaching the body how to maintain really, really good form. I mean, ultimately that's what swimming is we want people to continue to be able to swim faster, longer, while not falling apart, but really emphasizing that. So that's what a swim workout would look like. With running right now, doing strength work, starting to incorporate hills at this point. And when I say hills, like I'll range that from anywhere from like what I would call power hills, which are, anywhere from 80 meters, up to like 30 seconds long, for once again to really start working on proper technique, but also building some strength and power. And I would couple that with, a longer aerobic, like lead in, run into it, and then maybe afterward. And all the way up to longer hills. So you're actually just going for a longer run on hilly terrain and or doing longer hill repeats. I think the important thing with this time of the year, when you're talking about like that specificity and that workout and how it would look different later in the year, is that keeping heart rates more in check. And I don't know what your listeners or you are normally used to, like in heart rate zones, but it's what I would use, because I use like kind of, maybe, I don't know if you want to call it traditional, but the 1 through 5 C zones, like, doing these types of workouts, like in the 3 zone, maybe high 3 zone when they're on these intervals. So obviously the intervals are not near max effort. In fact, they're still, slightly below threshold stuff. So it's more about form, technique, and strength. And on a bike, similar stuff. I love doing over gear work at this time of the year, especially with athletes who need to work on bike power, develop bike power, bike strength. So low cadence repeats. Once again, power levels and or heart rate levels aren't too high. I think that's important. And a mistake that like some athletes make is, they start, they say, oh, well, I'm going to go do, these over gear repeats today. And they're pushing, power, their power zone 5 or 6 and, completely destroying themselves. So it's more about the functionality of it, keeping power, more of that 3 zone area or heart rate 3 zone area as well, and developing that. So those are kind of 3 specifics for those, at this time of the year.
Yeah, that aspect about not going at too high a power in your overgear work, that's a topic for an entire podcast, I think. But
absolutely, yeah. Well, and honestly, it's a hard thing, with athletes, especially young athletes, at this time of the year, is they want to, well, they want to impress you with their numbers, but also, they're not thinking so long term. So yeah, you got to be like, no, go ahead and hold back. And it's okay if you're not rocking these numbers, because this is the point of this,
Yeah. For your bread and butter 6-hour ride or 2-hour run, long aerobic work, do you prescribe that by heart rate? Is that the guiding light there that the athlete should follow, or do you work with pace, power for those two? What is the most important, and how do you prefer to prescribe those aerobic sessions?
Yeah, well, so that's a great question, because there's a couple different answers to that. In general, I work with power numbers, and I use heart rate like as a backup on cycling and to watch for decoupling with power numbers. But in general and prescriptively, I use only power numbers on the bike, no matter what time of the year it is, even if it's an aerobic ride, like you said, a 6-hour aerobic ride, I would say, it's like 1 to 2 zones, maybe 1 to 3 zones, depending upon where we are and what's going on. With running, with my specific athletes, I love to use pace zones because I'm familiar with them enough, and I know where they are. I know where they need to be. So I like to prescribe based on pace, so I'll say you need to be running at, this, average this per kilometer type of thing, even for these long aerobic runs. But I'll also look at heart rate for that too. I have a tendency, and this is kind of like the caveat or the asterisk to this, with running, if it's an aerobic run, I usually tell people, I usually don't give them a pace zone. So it's kind of in contrast to what I said, but I'll just say, hey, keep your heart rate low, or, keep it in this range and everything. And people, especially professionals, know the difference between, aerobic and not aerobic. So I don't necessarily have to say, hey, specifically run at this pace zone. I do definitely, as I get into more intensity, tempo work, etc., and on the bike, the same thing, prescribe very specific zones, pace zones. And I think that's it's a critical part of my training, is because it helps build the confidence in the athlete when they're seeing that they're hitting these specific pace zones. But me as a coach, it knows, I guess I've been doing this long enough that I know if they can hold this power for this amount of time over this many intervals, and, or, this pace over this amount of time, or this distance when they're running, I know I have a really good idea of exactly where they are, and they get a good idea of where they are. So it gives them confidence on race day to go out and execute, the exact game plan. Kind of one other additional thing to this that I'd like to add is, this time of the year is, a lot of, like you said, somewhat non-specific, go out and ride 6-hour type stuff. However, I would say in particular with running, this time of the year, that is, what a lot of the athletes are doing. But as we progress into the season, it becomes more or less so that's the case. Almost every workout has some type of specificity in it. It's very rare, as we get later into the season, that I'm just like, hey, just go ride your bike, for a few hours.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I actually, in a previous interview that I did today, we got to talking about Lydiard and how Lydiard prescribed. He's famous for obviously the aerobic base whole kind of concept, but that didn't mean that they were jogging around. But actually, they were pretty solid, steady aerobic, kind of high aerobic almost, if you want to call them that, runs that they did when they went out on their long days. And I guess that's what you're alluding to there, that there's that the smell the roses kinds of rides and runs where you actually just go out and do whatever sort of pace or effort, and it can be like a ride to the coffee shop with a bunch of friends, and you don't need to do anything more than just spin the pedals in your easiest gear, and do whatever like that. That might be a very limited part of your training. Is that what you're saying there?
Yeah, and you touched on two things. I'm a big Lydiard fan. I do like Lydiard. I like his principles. I found, his athletes were highly successful. I've went to talks of his back when he was still alive, and he was he's a very fascinating guy. And I mean, like I said, he was very successful. And personally, my body responded to Lydiard type training. So I am a Lydiard fan, but that is very true. And that's not to discount the importance of, those, like you said, coffee shop rides, because those are super important, as long as they're balanced out, like you said, with the slight more specificity. And this is another kind of interesting tidbit. One major thing that I've learned, and I learned pretty quickly working with the East Africans, is, and it's also funny when people, when I'm working with people, age groupers, I'll say with the East Africans, I guess, they're very good at going really hard when they're supposed to go really hard, but they're also very good at going really easy on their easy days. And what I'm saying is, my age, like, I'll have an amateur athlete, come to visit me or do a training camp with me, and I'll say, well, on this one day I'll send you out running with the East Africans. And they're like, no way, there's no way I can do that. I mean, those guys are so fast. And I'm like, no, trust me, you'll be fine. And, they'll go for whatever, a 15-kilometer run at 5 minutes per kilometer with, these people who are incredibly fast runners. And they come home at the end of that day and you're like, you're right. Oh, that was an easy run. These guys aren't that fast. And then the next day we'll do some tempo work, and, and they'll just get completely destroyed.
Yeah.
but my whole thing about that is the East Africans, one major thing that I've learned from them, and I think it's a cliche of, like, Western, coaching and culture is, we have a tendency to go too hard on our easy days and, not quite hard enough on our hard days. And, like, I really believe in that polarization of it. And like I said, working with the East Africans has even solidified that more in my brain, because I see the benefit of them, going on these coffee shop rides or runs, whatever you want to call them, and then, the highly specific days the next day.
Yeah. So the word polarized, or the term polarized training, is something that is also gaining a lot of traction for a number of years already. And you mentioned, like, a lot of what you say is definitely agreeing with those principles. In the specifics with the polarized training of, like, 8 sessions out of 10 easy, or 80 to 90% of the time at a low intensity training zone, do you think that your training follows roughly those prescription in terms of the numbers as well, or is it more at a contextual level, with just going really easy when you're meant to, and going really hard when you're meant to?
Well, I would say that, like, with the training that, like, I prescribe, like, I don't specifically calculate, percentages, like, what percentage is an athlete at this, level. But I would say the crazy thing is, and I think this happens a lot with the training, is at the end of the, season or year, if you look back upon the weeks and everything, like, people are within very close percentages, like with an 80-20 type principle of, intensity versus aerobic type work. And once again, but we're talking with different athletes, it varies. And let's say it varies, 1 or 2%, maybe a person's 78, 18, or a person's 82, or I'm sorry, yeah, that's what I meant. 82, 18, 78, 22%. Like, it's pretty close and pretty dialed in with those athletes. And it just kind of, like, ends up falling out that way.
Yeah. And does the athlete volume make, like, if you compare a professional versus an amateur, is it still more or less the same within a certain margin of error there, as you mentioned, or do the amateurs do more intensity, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, well, so in general, I would say that professionals probably can handle a bit more intensity. And this is what I would say, kind of, and not even breaking it down between amateurs and professionals, more looking at experience levels. And, if I'm dealing with an amateur who has been racing triathlon for 20 years, normally, historically, I would say, they probably need a little less foundation, a little less base, and will respond quicker to that base and be able to add intensity earlier in the program, or add intensity a little bit later in the program, respond to it relatively quickly in a preparation for a race. The same as most pros obviously have, pretty big foundation in themselves, like from either a previous sport or from doing this sport or some type of endurance sport for a lot of years. So kind of the same thing is, I would say that they respond quicker, but their buildup needs to be even, maybe less. Yeah.
Yeah. All clear. And when we're talking about intensity and the intense workout, so one of the things that we talked about already is the specificity. So you will, I'm sure, be doing a certain race-specific workouts in the lead up to a race. But especially for Ironman athletes, that's not particularly intense in the grand scheme of things. So, and you also mentioned going really hard when you should go really hard. So how big a part does those really hard workouts, the really high intensities, how big a part does that play in your athlete's preparation, and when do you put that in? Because it's probably not now in the base season based on what we've been discussing, but
right.
when does it happen?
Right. Well, it's specificity. I mean, looking at, once again, depending upon the athlete, 12 weeks out from like a super high priority races, when, we really start getting into specific work and, and putting in, because that allows you to put in, a few really solid blocks and get a really good idea of where you are. But I would say, like, that's kind of to answer that part of the question. The other question, or part of the question, is like, how much do you go over, say, race pace type stuff, or like you said, with Ironman type stuff. If I go tell a person to go for a 2-hour ride at Ironman pace, it's probably not going to be too big of a problem. When Ironman pace becomes a problem is at the 5-hour mark.
Yeah.
And but replicating that type of work, and also, or this is another kind of key thing, is overstimulating on the front end of a workout, and then going above race pace stuff, doing intervals at above race pace at a harder level fatigue. And then walking into more Ironman type pace stuff, or kind of another version of that is to be stacking workouts. So, stacking days so that you're replicating. So you're replicating Ironman feel and or fatigue or similar levels of fatigue, without having that much volume or risking injury, by saying, hey, you're just going to run, 20 or 40 kilometers today or whatever. So that's kind of like two things is like, I don't know if that's making sense, but like by stacking
sure.
workout. Yeah. Okay, good.
Training in doing the race specific work in sort of pre-fatigue state, however you achieve that, whether it's in the same workout or by the stacking of prior days workouts.
Yep, exactly.
And I guess the question, another question is, I imagine that your runners, they will be doing track intervals at pretty fast, let's say 10K, 5K race pace, even if they are primarily focusing on the half or full marathon. And does that apply to your Ironman triathletes as well, that they will be doing those, if we want to call them Vo2 Max type of intervals almost, at least if we're talking close to 5K race pace?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I will. Then that's very much so, even with the Ironman athletes, and especially if that's a weakness or an area, in which they're weak. I feel like, with the Ironman athletes, like the first thing that we need to make sure is there is the strength and the ability, to run the volume off of the bike or whatever. But yeah, adding in, like I said, obviously with Ironman athletes, there's less of that, less of that than even with a marathon runner. Because once again, your ability, kind of like what you were talking about before, is if you talk about an athlete, if I tell one of my Ironman athletes to go run Ironman pace marathon today, they probably could. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They probably wouldn't. I mean, it would, sure, it'd be a good tempo effort. I mean, like I said, Ben Hoffman ran a 2:36, and that's pretty darn fast, no matter how you slice it. But you can. He could do it though, is the point. And it's the trick is doing it off the bike. So I do, because of that though, because he could do that, we do inject more, like you said, we do some VO2 fartlek type work, definitely in those last final phases, and some higher intensity, longer repeats, too, that are definitely faster than race pace.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. You mentioned there at a point the difference between long course and short course training. So if we can just briefly recap this, like what are your thoughts on the differences, where they exist, and also where they don't exist, where they might be very similar in how you approach the different distances?
Right. Well, I think one key thing with short course racing is if you're talking draft legal or not. So
yeah, let's assume draft legal. So
okay. Yeah. Well, so draft legal, it's so much of a lactate, metabolizing lactate type of an event. It's very aggressive. It's very hard. It's very punchy. And I would say that's not a scientific term, but that's the difference between Ironman racing for the most part. And I'll kind of get into details with that a little bit, but and Olympic distance draft legal racing. And Olympic distance draft legal racing, a lot of it's like bike racing in a sense, in that you're either responding to a move, to an attack, to an event, and or you're creating that in Olympic distance racing. In Ironman racing, a lot of times you're not. It's a lot more internal. It's a lot more steady. Sure, there's attacks. They're not as aggressive. You have more time to respond to them. You can respond to them in your own time, and all of that. So it makes it actually, somewhat different with the training as well, because when we're talking about specificity and you're talking about an Olympic distance athlete, you do that type of stuff, a lot more of the on-off stuff, a lot more of the anaerobic type work, a lot more of that, anaerobic threshold type work, Vo2 Max work, like what you're saying, basically getting an athlete to the point where they can go very hard, bounce back, go very hard, bounce back, go very hard, bounce back, and on and so forth. Whereas an Ironman athlete, those workouts are a lot more like, can you just go really, really, really hard for a long time? So, yeah, but they are actually, quite different. One principle that I believe in with both of those, and this goes back to, once again, some old school running days, and even looking at like using Sebastian Coe, who now is the head of the IAAF, as you probably well know. But if you look, he was an 800 meter runner and 1500 meter runner, which we'll say that's analogous to an Olympic distance triathlete. Not totally aligned, but actually in some ways it is. And that guy still did a tremendous amount of, if you look at his training, he still did a tremendous amount of strength work, and he did a tremendous amount of volume, actually, especially when you talk about like periodization. But even when he was racing, 1500 meters, 800 meters, and he was the best in the world, he was still holding pretty good volume. And so I would say that a similarity, although not at the same levels, but at least for me, with Olympic distance, top level world-class athletes that are doing draft legal racing, I still believe in getting the big base work in and the big volume in, and definitely, in that base type season. But even as they're into race season, I like to maintain a relatively high level of volume and strength, because ultimately at the end of the day, even in an Olympic distance race, you need to have that ability to respond to aggressive attacks and also create them in yourself. But at the end of the day, you're still running a 10K after swimming 1500 meters and biking 40 kilometers, which there's certainly a strength component to that.
Yeah, for sure. And the ability to recover from those anaerobic bursts is heavily dependent on the aerobic system of the athlete. So
exactly. Exactly.
A funny anecdote about, I think it was Sebastian Coe that, according to legend at least, went out to run 3 times on Christmas Day because he was scared that his rival of the time, whose name I can't remember, was also running, and so he went out for a first and then a second and then maybe even a third run. If I get that right.
I think I've seen that that as well. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I woke up on Christmas Day and I was feeling. Yeah, like, well, if he's running, twice, then I better run 3 times.
Yeah, for mid distance runner. Yeah. What about the similarities and differences from what we talked about now, from the perspective perhaps of like the ideal professional athlete scenario? What are the similarities and differences that age groupers that still form the majority of our listenership should take into account when applying these principles to their training?
A big thing, well, we talked about this before, and I always say this: the principles are identical, for an age group athlete versus a professional athlete. Physiology is physiology. Sure, people, pros, might have, higher levels of this or whatever, or more of this, but still, like, it just needs to be adapted to that specific level. A couple things that are important, and like, I can't preach this enough, but is the treating your hard days hard and your easy days easy. And I think that this is almost more of a problem with age group athletes than it is with professionals. And they get caught up in their group whatever easy day, or they think that just going extra hard on easy days is going to make them a better athlete, and ultimately it doesn't allow them to. It basically softens their ability to do or push at the level that they need to push at their on their hard days or whatever. So I think that's a really big thing with age group athletes, is like making sure that they are taking it easy and that they are incorporating rest into their schedules, because that's big. I would say with age groupers more than with professionals, like, I definitely get the people who, they just think that more is better. And that, and I always say, if more was better, then it would be pretty easy. Like, for me to train the best Ironman athlete in the world, I would just give them more than anyone else and they would win. Right. That's obviously not the answer, but I think people, sometimes get caught up with that. But another big thing with age groupers, that was what I would say is creating and following a plan. And the other, I find with some age group athletes, we were touching on this before, but that they're always at a good level of fitness. You know what I mean? They don't give themselves an opportunity to fall out of shape, which also doesn't give them an opportunity to pop into, like, really great shape. So if we're looking at a scale from 1 to 10, they're hovering around a 7 all year long, but they're never getting to that 10, because they don't ever let they don't allow themselves to get to that 3 either, And like, I would really encourage age groupers to, allow that, to create a season and a schedule that allows them to have these really high peaks, but to also have some downtime. Even if they don't feel like they need it, it's important.
What would the downtime look like for you? Would you prescribe 2 weeks off, or 4 weeks of just random exercise at most X amount of minutes per day? Or if you give some examples of what it could be.
No, totally. I would say, if someone's comfortable with it, and some people aren't, I would say, like you said, after your biggest race of the season, to take 2 weeks completely off. And that doesn't, we're all triathletes. And so most of us, completely off doesn't exist, which is fine. But basically, when I say 2 weeks off, it means no structure. You know what I mean? Wake up, do what feels good. And like with athletes that I work with, I'll give them parameters. If we have a 2 weeks, say 2 weeks off period, I'll be like, okay, I'm not going to put anything on your schedules this 2 weeks. However, if you do something, don't do any swims over 2,000 meters, don't do any runs over an hour, and don't do any bike rides over 2 hours, and all of that. If you do any of that, don't do more than 2 workouts a day, and also keep it all aerobic, like nothing over the 2 zone.
Yeah.
So, but then normally, after that, like having a 2 week, preparatory type period where basically you're doing just that, what I just said, is, a bunch of aerobic work with just range of motion, form, technique, that type of stuff to get into it. But, you look at, the race calendar anymore with Ironman, half Ironman, and even Olympic distance racing is it's super easy to race year round if you wanted to, especially if you're willing to travel. But, say historically, like for Finland or, the United States, Europe, especially Northern Europe, our off time is normally, November-ish, December-ish. And it falls in, it aligns well with that, where you can actually give yourself a couple months in that period to do very completely aerobic work. So, maybe a month of that is like the super light stuff, like I said, 2 weeks of nothing, 2 weeks of pretty light range of motion stuff, and then a month of basically like, simple aerobic work. And then, by January, you're starting to get into it, considering maybe your first race is in, April or May or something.
Yeah. And how so you mentioned recovery earlier, and that you consider that super important for the age groupers, especially. How does that factor in the actual structure of the plan? Do you like to prescribe regular rest days completely off, or just regularly have that lighter week or deload week, so to say? What would the specifics look like?
Both. And, it's athlete dependent, of course, but definitely, like I historically use 3 to 4 week cycles. So either, 2 weeks up with like 1 week down. And we're talking with age groupers here, especially if they have work schedules and stuff that they're working around. Either 2 weeks up and 1 week down, or 3 weeks up and 1 week down. So, either a 3 or 4 week cycle there. I think, and when I say down, normally the percentages, the two things on that down week or rest 5-day period or whatever it is normally, like I said, 3 to 7 days is, volume load is probably at, say, 70%. So it's actually not like, totally cutting out the volume. Intensity drops significantly though. So it's more heart rate rest than it is, even like, leg, like standing time rest. So, so that's like on and I guess I maybe should have started with a yearly cycle. And saying a yearly cycle, I would go through that, 2 or 3 times, depending upon when people's races are. And like I said, with like, let's say you're doing 3 races a year, I would say after your first race, taking a week really light and then kind of get going back into it again. After your second race, taking a week really light to nothing, then getting back into it again. And then after that last race, going through that cycle, what we just talked about with like, actually taking a couple weeks down and then really kind of gradually. When we're talking about a monthly basis, like I said, the 2 or 3 weeks up, with the 1 week down, with that 1 week, like you said, probably 70% load, but with no high heart rate stuff in general. And then within a weekly basis, it's like, personally, I like to do sometimes blocks of a couple days. So it's not like a traditional, like 1 day up, 1 day down, 1 day up, 1 day down, 1 day up, 1 day down. Like, sometimes I'll do an overload of 2 days and then take 2 days down from that. And some days it's an overload of 2 days with 1 day down. It just depends upon how big of that overload was, and also how fit the athlete is and how quickly I know they're recovering and or adapting to the training.
Yeah. The microcycles is another topic that could form a really long and interesting podcast, I think. But sure. Let's leave it at that for now. One thing that I do want to get into is nutrition. So what are your thoughts around that for triathletes, both on the professional and amateur level? I guess I don't assume that there will be any big differences there.
No, there's not. And once again, it's pretty similar as far as. And are you talking about like race day or pre-race nutrition? Or are you just talking about nutrition in general?
Yeah, let's touch upon nutrition in general first, and then we can touch upon race day nutrition.
Yeah. Nutrition in general. Once again, this is what my graduate work was in, at least partially. And I would say I'm pretty traditional and it's simple to me, I guess. I always see, all these fads in nutrition, and ultimately, what it comes down to is eating clean, whole food. And whether that means totally vegan or, or eating meat or whatever. I know that a big trend right now with that, that documentary on Netflix and, is like more of a vegan diet, which I think is completely fine. And like, if I had an athlete come to me and say, hey, not eating any meat protein, I'd be like, that's great. We can totally make that work. And you can definitely be still highly successful by doing that. But I also, if a person said I have to eat meat, I would say that's totally fine too. And we can make that work. What I think is important is making sure and just being conscious of making sure that you are kind of a couple core things, making sure that you're obviously getting food in at the right time to ensure proper recovery. And then also trying to eat, like I said, eat like nutrient rich foods that are, as whole as possible. And also trying to avoid anything that's processed and sugars. And sugar has an incredibly important role. So when I say avoid sugars, there's times where you shouldn't. And I'm a believer in that too. And I'm not a giant believer in that, we're going to try to race this Ironman, on fat stores, because at certain intensities, that's just not possible. Can we get maybe more efficient at processing it? Yes. But anyway, sugar, like I said, avoiding refined sugars during the day, unless we're talking about specific recovery periods, but just kind of avoiding that junk, like I'm a big advocate of too. So like I said, kind of 3 key things there is eating whole foods, eating them at the right time, and avoiding the bad stuff.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. It's simple. It's not dogmatic. I like it.
Right. Well, the funny thing is, and I mean, I feel like strength training is similar this way. I mean, we talk about this with periodization, but when you talk about general coaching philosophies of me, I'm kind of, I like it. It's pretty simple. You know what I mean? You need to, you take care of yourself, there's no secret magic bullets here. And with nutrition, I really, feel that way. There's always some new trend, but I mean, the funny thing about these nutritional trends is if you look at what was trendy 10 years ago, isn't anymore. So that must have meant that it wasn't really all that, important. But what we always come back to is those kind of key principles that I was just talking about. Said people always want it, and I mean it sells books and it sells magazines and it sells whatever. But keeping it simple. As my college coach used to always say, that we follow the KISS philosophy. And that's KISS. And you've probably heard of KISS philosophy as a keep it simple. And but his was keep it simple, stupid. Yeah. So that's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right with the fads come and go. But one thing that we haven't seen is the try to live on the processed food kind of fad where people are advocating for that being healthy. So that's something that has remained the same, that we like clean eating, as you say, and then we can work with that and work around that.
Right. Well, using real quickly the East Africans again as a example. They eat, I always say there's a reason why you don't, Ethiopian restaurants you do see, because Ethiopian food is like very flavorful and pretty amazing. Kenyans, and who I spend more time with the Kenyans, there's a reason why you don't see Kenyan food restaurants. And the reason why is because it's a very limited list of ingredients and it's not super flavorful. Yeah. So, however, these guys are some of the best athletes in the world. They're doing something right. And if I could describe their diet, it would be in one way. It's incredibly simple. And it's also incredibly whole. They're eating, especially at training camps in Kenya, stuff that they're growing right there, meat that they're processing right there. And the funny thing about the Kenyans too, and I mean, this is a daily part of my ritual, is, they drink tea, and they drink British style tea, 24 hours a day. And, we always talk about, what's the optimal recovery drink, and, chocolate milk. They had that whole campaign. But if you look at what the Kenyans drink for tea, which I'm serious, at their house, if you go to their house right now, there's a giant pot of tea on their stove, and it's there all day. And it is, 1 part black tea, 1 part milk, and then it always has some sweetener in it. And if you think about that, like just sugar, pure glucose sugar, it is like the optimal recovery drink. And it seems like a really simple thing, but it's like pretty amazing recovery drink in itself. So just intuitively, the Kenyans are on a good diet, and there is nothing fancy about that diet. It's very simple, but very whole.
Yeah. one final topic before we move on to the rapid fire questions, and that is something I saw in an interview that you did on YouTube, on a YouTube channel, and that was about being intuitive in your training and how that is kind of getting lost. Can you discuss this and discuss your thoughts on that?
Sorry, will you ask that again?
Yeah, so your thoughts on being intuitive with your training and in your training, and how that is something that is getting lost a bit these days.
Absolutely. No, yeah, it's huge. And I think in a sense, that's what the difference between a great athlete and a good athlete is. And I'll also say with coaching, it's very much the case. We're starting to get these athletes and coaches that think that the numbers answer everything, and they certainly don't. There's tons of, from a coaching side of things, you have to be able to recognize, what an athlete's responding to and what they're not, both emotionally, psychologically, and physiologically. And sure, you can crunch numbers all day long, but the numbers are easy to crunch. There's books about that, like actually understanding the athlete, listening to the athlete, and seeing stuff, like intuitively seeing things. That's what makes a really great coach. But along the lines of an athlete, it's the same thing. Is like, I'll get it's kind of the whole, like joke or cliche that, I don't have my power meter is not working today, so should I even go for my bike ride? It's like, yes, you're still going to actually get some benefits from this workout. And not only that, but it might be a good practice for you to try to hit these intervals at these numbers without actually seeing the numbers. You know what I mean? Because you have to become intuitive with it. And, I think it's funny too, because I could use a dozen examples of, people, in the race, I was supposed to push this power, but for some reason my power meter wasn't working right. And I could tell, but I wanted to hit that power anyway. So, I was just trying to hit it. And, by the halfway mark, I was totally wasted. And it was like, okay, yes, you should have intuitively said, something's not right here, so I can do this. Or nutritionally, like you prescribe something nutritionally during a race for an athlete, and they're like, well, I was puking right away, but you said I had to keep on bringing these calories in, so I just kept on eating and I kept on puking. And at that point, it's very clear that the athlete has lost touch with like actually listening to their own body. And I think that the way that we coach, and I mean, it's part of our responsibilities as coaches, is to try to add that level of intuition and understanding the sensations in their body. And like I'm just finishing up this book. I'm writing with Chris Foster. It's actually on Triathlete magazine. It's about sprint distance racing. But one of the first parameters that we talked about in like understanding where you are is using RPE. And so rating of perceived exertion, which is just an old school method. And, I think people like to discount it, but it's hugely important. And it's maybe the first thing that we should be teaching athletes is, how to, measure and understand yours. And like I said, kind of going back to the first part of that I said is, I really feel like that's the difference between good athletes and great athletes. Great athletes are able to both look at the numbers, the actual analytics, the actual data, and use that data, but they're also incredibly aware of their own sensation and, and how they feel and where they are at that level. And I think that's one thing that I love about working with pro triathletes is, sure, we can talk numbers all day long, but they really do truly understand their bodies. And for me as a coach, it's nice because I know that when they give me feedback on fatigue or on, how an effort level feels, they're so in tune, and that it's often, very accurate and very true. And I can trust them a lot. Whereas sometimes with, age group athletes, it's way more of a challenge because, they're so obsessed and connected with the numbers as opposed to, how they feel.
Yeah, totally agree. So let's move on to the final segment, which is the rapid fire questions. And the first one is, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to triathlon?
Ooh, boy, that's tough. Oh man, I can't. I honestly, I don't have any favorite. I with triathlon, and maybe this is a good thing, is I would say I get my information from everywhere. And I also recognize some of the things for what they are. I mean, some things it's entertainment value only. Other things are, I guess I go to some places for results. I go to some places for coaching philosophies, but I would say it's not even, specifically just, triathlon related. It's more like coaching, training related. And honestly, there's just, multiple people on Twitter that are constantly, publishing, or not publishing, but reviewing and or linking to, specific articles. And I pick those things up all the time. In fact, with our coaching group, we have, frequent phone calls with the entire group, and every phone call, I always send out one of the latest, greatest, articles, whether it's on strength training or on nutrition or on, some specific interval workout or something, to the group for us always to discuss. So I guess that's kind of a cop out on that answer, but I would say I get my information from kind of everywhere. And I mean, we live in the information age, and sifting through it is actually sometimes the greatest challenge.
Yeah, definitely. That was a bit more than 15 seconds, by the way. So I'll challenge you to keep it to that for the next ones. And the next one is, what's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
Consistency and just a constant belief and wanting to always learn more, always wanting to know more.
And finally, what do you wish you had known or done differently at some point in your athletic or coaching career?
Been more patient with myself, both athletically, but also as a coach. Just be more patient with myself.
And tell the listeners where they can find out more about you and your coaching business and everything that you got going on.
Yeah, for sure. We're on Instagram at Bolton Endurance. BoltonEndurance.com is our website, and those are probably the best two places to check out. We're also on Facebook. You could do a search for us, and we do posts on those things, just race results and different various things and everything. But our website's like all the information about me and the coaches involved with our group.
Yeah, we'll have links to that in the show notes, so people can find it easily. Thank you so much, Ryan. It's been, I really enjoyed talking to you. It's we've covered a lot of ground, I feel. So it's
for sure.
a meaty episode, I want to say, but it's been really fun.
Yeah, no, excellent. Yeah, I enjoyed it as well.
I hope that you enjoyed that episode. The show notes, as usual, can be found on thattriathlonshow.com. And remember that I have made a tag page where you can find all previous and future episodes that are tagged elite, like this episode where we talk about how coaches design the training for their elite athletes. And the next one is the final interview for now in this sort of lineup of elite coaching episodes. And in that interview, I will interview Faris Al-Sultan, who is famous for winning the Ironman World Championships in 2005. He has also placed on the podium twice in addition to that. And probably these days, because that's 15 years ago, he might be even more famous for being the coach of Patrick Lange, who placed third and then went on to win Kona twice. But Faris now works actually with the German Triathlon Federation, so his current role is to try to develop the next generation of Olympic medalists on the draft legal scene. And that is an interesting task because Germany has had so much success on the long distance scene, but really for many years the draft legal success has been non-existent, really. But they have some young and up-and-coming athletes that can turn that around, that with some good coaching expertise that Faris will help provide. I'm sure that Germany will be a nation to look out for in the next few years, if not in the Tokyo Olympics. It was a great discussion that I had with Faris, so definitely you don't want to miss that. Subscribe to the podcast if you aren't already. If you need any help with your training, whether it's in the form of a ready-made training plan, a customized training plan, or individual coaching, check out scientifictriathlon.com, where we offer all of those product and service levels to suit your needs. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Take their free online sweat test to get a personalized hydration strategy for your next race, and get 15% off your order with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And big thanks to Roka, the world-leading manufacturers of wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, sunglasses, and prescription glasses. You can find them on roka.com/TTS to get 20% off your entire order. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.